I try to live my life without too many regrets. Sure, I've had my ups and downs like everyone else, but I do my best not to worry too much about what might have happened if I had made a different choice, if I might not have taken the road less traveled. I believe that everyone makes the best decisions they can based on the information available to them at the time. Going through all the what-ifs is ridiculous, because the only way to make a different choice is if you had some other information, which of course you didn't. Hindsight is perfect, and even then you can never be sure exactly what the sequence of events would have looked like if you had gone right instead of left. And yet there is one choice I made, one road I took, and I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had done things differently. My job involves constant traveling. I'm not going to go into the details of what I do. It's not relevant to this story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and since it was the closest town to home since I moved away for college, I took the opportunity to visit my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again soon, and my folks weren't getting any younger, so I tried to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to see them. If I had thought about it when I was looking for a place to live, I might have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of Jersey City to avoid rush hour traffic. But by the time I realized this, the lease was signed, and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring, to be honest. I drove across the river on the Ben Franklin Bridge, took I-476 for about an hour, then took a long drive on I-80 through pretty much the entire state of Pennsylvania, and then drove north on I-79 for another hour to Erie, PA, where I'm from. The only difference in the trip was how long it would take me to get through Philadelphia, because once I got on Route 476, I could usually predict my arrival time within 5 to 10 minutes. In my second summer in Jersey, I took 2 weeks off and planned to spend the second week in Erie. However, on the first Wednesday, everything changed because a major hurricane blew through and knocked out power to much of the area where I lived. Dealing with 90-degree heat without air conditioning was not something I wanted to do for the first half of my holiday. So after one uncomfortably sweaty night, I informed my parents that I would be leaving a few days early. In hindsight, I should have left in the morning. But since I had a few things to take care of before the trip, by the time I finally hit the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime, and it was getting to mid-afternoon. For some reason, the traffic in Philadelphia was particularly heavy, and by the time I finally made it through the city, I was a full hour behind schedule. Still, based on my normal schedule, I figured I would arrive early enough to have dinner and a beer with my dad and brother before checking in for the night. Two things I hadn't taken into account were the number of other people who apparently had the same idea of getting out of town as I did, and the road construction that must have unfolded in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a damn good thing. Being able to drive on it at 65, 70, and in some remote places like West Texas, even faster, makes road trips across the country take many times less time than they would otherwise. I can't tell you how many times my family reminisces about the days before the advent of interstates, when a trip to visit friends outside of Washington took almost twice as long as it does now. But what really strikes me is that while the entire highway system was built from start to finish in just 35 years, it seems that once parts of it are under construction, they remain so forever. Traffic was uncharacteristically heavy but moving, and I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs informing me that our 4 lanes were being reduced to 3, then 2, and then 1. Hundreds of cones stretched across the road as far as the eye could see, and I could certainly see the cars in front of me come to a complete stop. It was one of the worst gridlocks I've ever found myself in. Seriously, I think I covered a mile in an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach rumbled. When the exit ahead showed up, and there was no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off the road and found a diner to grab a bite to eat. After finishing my meal, I hit the road again. Things seemed to be improving for a few miles, But then I pulled up to the back of the jam and found myself waiting again. We were moving a little better, I think averaging about 5 miles per hour, but as the sun began to slip towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and looked to see if Google Maps could tell me some sort of detour. Human nature is funny. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports have shown that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to retrieve their luggage, even if the total time would be shorter if they had to wait a little longer at the aircraft. Well, the power of the internet was in my favor. Although the I-80 motorway was still a dark red stripe for another 50 miles or so, a southbound county road appeared a few miles later and a northbound one a couple of miles later, both of which seemed to allow me to get past the most serious traffic jams. Since I had spent most of the day sitting on the road, my patience was wearing thin, and I decided to take the southbound road, even though the app told me it would end up taking 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house. I just wanted to get on the road sooner, so I decided that at this rate, it would still take me more than 30 minutes to get to the northern route, and that choice would haunt me until the day I died. I turned onto the road and immediately felt my mood improve. Signs alternately limited my speed between 35 and 40 miles per hour, but even that seemed like a span compared to the congestion I'd spent the last few hours in. The ride was interesting. The road started out a little twisty, with lots of elevation changes as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It led me on a general southwestern diagonal, but twisted and bifurcated in such a way that for the first 30 minutes or so, I was regularly watching the gridlock traffic on I-80. Very soon after that, however, just as the sun was already dipping behind a couple of hills in my rearview mirror, the road made a long curve and carried me down and away from the site of the interstate. A lot of people don't realize how big the state of Pennsylvania is. Sure, there are plenty of big ones, but Pennsylvania is deceptively large, and it's remote. Isolated. Heck, the name translates to Pennsylvania Woods, after all. The Blair Witch didn't need to sugarcoat that aspect of the state. The fact that you can go into the woods and walk dozens of miles in any direction without encountering anything resembling another human being. There are a decent number of major cities here. Pittsburgh and Philadelphia have populations large enough to support major sports teams. But away from these centers of development, Harrisburg, Pottsville, Scranton, and so on, it's nothing. Nothingness and trees, and a dark, lonely road. That was the road I drove that night, winding through the winding slopes of the Appalachian foothills. I've moved around a lot. I mentioned, traveled through almost every continental state, sometimes driving along tarmac surrounded by nothing but untouched wilderness. I wondered what it was like to build such a road. What was it like before it was invaded by humans with our civilization and cars? What inhabited it? I don't wonder about that anymore, not since the night I went left instead of right. The road continued to loop back and forth, up and down. As I got deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, the branches on either side of the road stretching out and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet high that blocked my view of the sky and the stars overhead. I drove with the high beam on, because the idea of streetlights had never occurred to those who built this road. The painted lines were old and poorly maintained, and I gradually made my way over to the faded double yellow dividing strip, running down the middle of the two lanes to keep some distance between myself and the trees that were increasingly over the edge of the pavement. I'd never been a particularly good navigator. My parents said it was because I used to have my nose buried in a book during car journeys when I was a kid, but personally I think it's just because I'm not good at it. So even though there was no way I could get lost because there were no other roads I could turn off onto and lose my way, I found myself checking my phone more and more often to make sure I was still on the right track. That's how I almost collided with another car. My mind wandered, thinking about the fact that the signal strength had dropped and remained at 0 for the past 20 minutes, and the possible repercussions this could have if I had some sort of emergency. I returned my gaze to the road after Google Maps had confirmed for the 20th time that I hadn't misjudged my route. and after my brain had realized with some delay that what I was rapidly approaching was a car stopped in the middle of the lane, hit the brakes. I stopped in time, but not by much. I was about 5 feet from the other car's rear bumper. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline rushing through my body, but fear was quickly replaced by anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only had he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his headlights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, I probably wouldn't have seen him before I was practically on top of him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my pulse beating in a vein in my neck. I'm not one for quick road rage, and after a couple of quick breaths, I managed to pull myself together. Not wanting to openly alarm anyone who might still be in the car, I shifted into reverse and backed out 20 feet, switching on my emergency lights. It was then that I noticed a few oddities about the stopped car, besides the fact that its headlights were out. Sure, it had stopped right in the middle of the road, but that was unreasonable since there was no curb here for the driver to move to. The odd thing was that all the doors were open, and the driver's door was even slightly out into the oncoming lane. Upon further observation, I saw that some sort of object, what appeared to be a baby stuffed animal, had fallen out of the driver's side rear door onto the road. I considered my options, and after a few seconds decided that, against my better judgment, I would have to continue on my way and get out into the street to get a better idea of what was going on. I've said before that my work has nothing to do with this story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my decisions too harshly, it's worth mentioning that I spent some time in the military. The obligation to help people has been drummed into me over the years, and I saw enough things while in the service to feel like I could handle myself. So I got out of the car, but I didn't switch it off. I opened the boot to grab the torch I keep in there and left the headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to spot signs of other cars approaching, but I had no luck. "Hello," I called out to the other car as I cautiously started to approach it, skirting round to the left down the middle of the road to be able to look inside before I got too close. "Anybody there?" There was no reply. The beams from the headlights helped a little, but the shadows were enough to make it impossible to see the interior of the car. Shining the torch, I had no trouble determining that there was no one inside. I moved closer and leaned over to the back door to pick up a fallen object from the ground. It was a child's toy, just as I'd surmised. A plush rabbit with scuffed spots that showed the marks of frequent lovemaking. I frowned. If the guys in the car had sprung a passerby, they'd take the rabbit away, or the kid would have an embarrassment. I closed the back door and walked to the front. Putting my hand on the bonnet, I found that it was still warm to the touch. That meant the car hadn't been here very long. I moved to the driver's seat to see if there was some mechanical problem that would cause the car to stop, and was surprised to find the bunch of keys still dangling in the ignition. Hitting the brake, I turned the key and the engine started immediately. The headlights and dim roof light came to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery. All the gauges were normal. Not even the check engine light came on. Curious and even more curious. Then I saw a purse on the passenger seat. I picked it up, a plain brown shoulder bag, and rummaged through it briefly before finding my wallet inside. Everything was intact. About $40 in cash, a couple of credit cards, a gym membership, and a Sam's Club card. The driver's license listed Mary Walker, a pretty blonde who had turned 30 the month before. In a couple of photographs, Mary was captured in staged poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree whose leaves were tinged with reds and yellows, captured in the captivity of autumn. A huge bearded male lumberjack was hugging her from behind, and on his lap sat a little girl with a ponytail and an exaggerated smile. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and a shiver ran to the base of my spine. Something about this situation was very wrong. I put everything back in my purse and returned it to the seat, turned off the car, and got out, closing the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it above my head to try and make a connection, but to no avail. Cussing softly, I pressed the red end call button and made my way over to the passenger side of the car. Looking around with my torch, I noticed that the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, as if someone had walked on it. I didn't know the woods well enough to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even so, I couldn't imagine why they might have wandered off. Shining my light into the forest, I saw that the beam only made it through the trees for about 30 feet before being swallowed up by the greedy blackness. Looking at the muffled leaves, the stuffed rabbit in my hand, and then at the dark trees viciously closing in on me, I pondered what I should do. I made a decision. I was trained to help people. It was embedded in my system. Somewhere in the woods was a child. I lifted my foot to take a step onto the beaten path, and at that moment, a white movement flashed in the beam of my torch. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swinging out of sync with the rest of her body, like a marionette being controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Hello," her voice called out. "Is anyone there?" Behind her, new figures appeared, trudging along the road. Here was a bearded man, must be Mary's husband. Here was her little daughter, mistress of her favorite rabbit. Both naked, both moving as strangely as their wife and mother. And now I could tell there were more of them. There were many of them, their shapes indistinct in the direct light, but there were so many of them that their strange, lurching footsteps made the darkness hum, and their voices a chorus. "Hello," they called. "Is anyone there?" Repeating the questions I had asked only minutes ago as I approached the abandoned car. Stumbling, I took a step backwards, away from the woods and the approaching gunman, tripping over Walker's car. As I caught my balance, I shone my torch into the thicket of branches and barely made out a sort of ghostly line in the upper edge of the darkness, even darker than the trees. Did it seem to me that those lines of pure blackness stretching from the hidden mass and seeming to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other figures moving with them? "Hello, is anyone there?" I ran to my car, the engine of which, thankfully, was still running, headlights and emergency lights flashing cheerfully. "Hello." I shifted into reverse, miraculously keeping my head from driving off the road as I completed the three-point turn. "Anyone there?" I cast a glance in the rearview mirror. The pale figure of Mary Walker stood at the edge of the woods where the trees converged with the road. One hand was raised, beckoning me to return or perhaps wave goodbye, her face a mask of confused sadness. I pressed on the gas and drove back the way I had come. I didn't look back again. The rest of the journey passed like a blur. At some point after I got on the motorway, I called my parents to let them know I wouldn't arrive until late. I was driving on autopilot, as the traffic had dissipated while I was away. I thought about calling 911, but didn't. What would I tell them? And for what purpose? There was no one to help. I try not to have too many regrets in life, pondering the what-ifs. But this case, this choice. What if I had left sooner? What if I hadn't stopped for lunch? Maybe I would have left anyway. Maybe I would have had time to help the Walkers. Maybe I would have been picked up by that black thing that fished in the dark. What if I'd gone to the right? Would I have gone on mindlessly through life like that, not knowing that there are other things in the world? I try not to think about it too often, but every now and then my thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I got to my parents' house that evening that I realized I was still clutching it in my hand. Before humans paved roads and created civilization, I often wondered what was the wilderness like. What lived there? I don't ask myself that question anymore. I can't afford to, at least not unless I want to wake up screaming. And no matter how bad the traffic gets, I always stick to the interstates.